The event is the second webinar in a series of webinars on transformation and change in the international order. The next event that we have coming up is on the 24th of February, and that's going to be on towards a post-American century, geopolitics in a new multipolar world. Now, I'll pop my email in the chat box, so if you wish to be added to the mailing list for that, you can drop me a line, or you can follow at OU Politics on Twitter, where we'll also be promoting that. I'm going to ask that to avoid any sort of audiovisual disturbances, if all of our audience members could please mute their microphones and disable their cameras, that would be really helpful. Speakers obviously not to do that until after the introductions. We're going to have a range of short presentations, around 8 to 10 minutes from each of the speakers. If whilst that's going on you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat box, and I will collate and direct those in the final part of the session. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our fantastic range of speakers joining us from across the world. First of all, we have Dr. Jonathan Fulton, who's an assistant professor of political science at Zayed University in the UAE, and he's a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. His research is focused on obviously the BRI, but also China's relationships more broadly with the Gulf states. From the other side of the globe, we have Nilanthi Samaranayake, who's the director of the Strategy and Policy Analysis Programme at CNA, and she works mainly on security in the Indian Ocean and the South Asian region, and relations between China and many of the smaller countries across South Asia. We have Dr. Filippo Boni, who's a lecturer in politics and international studies here at the Open University, and he works on China's investments in South Asia and Europe, and on China-Pakistan economic cooperation in particular. And last but not least, we have Dr. Moritz Pieper, who's based in the German Foreign Office but is speaking today in a personal capacity. And his research is on area studies in the post-Soviet space in the Middle East. His book, The Making of Eurasia, Competition and Cooperation Between China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia, is due out in the next couple of months with IB Tauris and Bloomsbury. And again, I'll post a link to that in the chat box if anybody wants to have another look at that. So I'm going to hand over now straight away to Jonathan. And if I can remind everybody just to make sure that your cameras and your mics are off for this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Precious. And thanks for giving me something to do this afternoon instead of watching what's happening in Washington, because obviously that's where a lot of the attention is going to be later on today. I'm going to be talking about China's relations with the Gulf countries, the Persian Gulf countries, or as we call it here in Abu Dhabi, where I'm speaking from, the Gulf. Persian being kind of a bad word over here. The question that I was given, I guess for all of us broadly, was how does the BRI shape domestic and international politics in the region? And I think in the Gulf, this is a particularly interesting question because as we've seen in recent years, China's been very actively involved on both sides of the Gulf, and that's a pretty tough balancing act to pull off. Most countries have had to follow the U.S. in this balancing approach, rather, to balance against Iran and work with the Gulf states. But China has actually been able to manage pretty good relations on both sides, which is not an easy feat. In terms of the BRI, but that said, it's not to say that it's particularly balanced in terms of where its interests lie or how it's approaching the two. So looking at the domestic side, what we see from the GCC, I think, is especially interesting. Gulf countries have been all engaged in these big scale vision projects, these development projects that we've all been seeing in recent years: Saudi Vision 2030, Oman Vision 2040, New Kuwait 2035. And these mostly came from Western companies who are peddling different goals about how to modernize or move beyond a post-rentier state economy or to build more diverse economies. But basically, they require a lot of infrastructure construction. They require building new sectors and a lot of smart technologies, digital economies, and things like this. This lines up almost perfectly with the Belt and Road cooperation priorities. So if you look at the 5 cooperation priorities of BRI that are in this white paper, facilities connectivity, increased trade, financial integration, policy coordination, and people-to-people relations, this all lines up very, very nicely with what the GCC countries are trying to do in these development projects. Some of the things that you typically hear about as negatives for BRI cooperation, there's this debt trap narrative, which we can talk about later, maybe in the Q&A session, but the sense that it creates dependencies. Well, this side of the Gulf, at least, you see a lot of the countries that are most deeply engaged with China and BRI projects. That's not really a concern. There's lots of FDI coming into the country from other sources. They actually have quite a lot of options. So it doesn't really create the same kind of dependency issues that you'd see. Another common one is labor issues, that China comes into a country with its own employees and its own labor force, and it doesn't really build towards giving local labor forces opportunities. Well, that also is really less of an issue here because you see very unusual demographics on the side of the Gulf. So, for example, I'm in the UAE, where about 90% of the country is expatriate. So you're not going to find too many Emirati or Saudis working in the construction sector over here. That's going to go mostly to South Asian laborers. So if Chinese companies come in and engage with them on these projects, and they do this with Chinese labor, it's not really going to affect the country that way. So there's quite a bit of interest in this. Now, again, the GCC countries aren't a coherent bloc by any stretch. If you've been following regional developments over the past few years, that's been very apparent. We've seen uneven engagement with China in BRI projects. At the top level, you'd see the UAE and Saudi, which are also countries that have the highest level of diplomatic relations with China at a comprehensive strategic partnership. They've been very, very actively engaged with China in this. They've been bringing it into a lot of different sectors. At the next level down, you'd see Oman and Kuwait, which are they're interested, but it seems domestic politics maybe make it a little tougher to pull off. Qatar, which up until the blockade seemed destined to be very deeply engaged with China, but since 2017, it's kind of taken a back seat. And then Bahrain, which economically is quite weak and hasn't really featured much in China's regional engagement. Now, on the other side of the Gulf, Iran, which in everything, it makes me think of that great Napoleon Bonaparte quote about Brazil. It's the country of the future, and it always will be. With Iran, there's just so much potential. This enormous market, this educated workforce, with a revisionist government that just is completely isolated within the region. So you don't see, every time it seems that China and Iran are about to engage in BRI or in other issues, something happens and it stops. When the JCPOA was signed in 2015, a few months later, President Xi Jinping went to Tehran, signed this comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran, and it looked like there's going to be a lot of momentum. They talked about increasing trade to about 300 billion between the two countries within 10 years. What happened? Well, later that year, there was a U.S. general election. Donald Trump won. Everybody knew that the U.S. is going to change direction on Iran, and China wasn't going to sacrifice its relationship with the U.S. To lend rhetorical or to lend support to a revisionist Iran. So we haven't really seen much in the way, despite wildly exaggerated reports from last summer. There's been very little movement towards China and Iran, and you can see this just in terms of trade and investments. So last year, for example, according to the IMF, as a bloc, China's trade with the GCC countries came up to about 165 billion. With Iran, it was worth about 19 billion. So obviously, China's preference would be, it's putting its money where its mouth where its money is, I guess. It's definitely on this side of the Gulf that its economic interests lie. And you see the same thing in terms of its contracting and investment. It's much more deeply engaged on this side. In terms of international impact, my research on the BRI, what I see in the Gulf is that there's generally two types of participating countries. There are countries that are engaged with China and Chinese SOEs for domestic projects. And this is great because it brings in money for these Chinese state-owned companies, but they're kind of standalone things. So for example, with Qatar, there's building this enormous new stadium for the FIFA World Cup or port expansion projects. That lends itself to the domestic ambitions of a country. But the second type you'll see are these projects that create these inter or intra-regional linkages. And that's where I think you'll find a lot more interest from Beijing in terms of engaging with these countries in BRI. And that's where you see, again, the GCC countries outperforming Iran. I think a lot of the analysis on Iran and the BRI has really focused on this overland linkage and saying, look, through this corridor, this overland corridor on the Silk Road economic belt, Iran could become a major partner. What's lost in that is just geography. To travel overland to Iran to get to the Gulf, you pass through a lot of sparsely populated, not particularly wealthy countries through Central Asia. Meanwhile, the Silk Road, the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, the seaborne part of BRI, really seems to be where a lot of the true commerce is happening. And with that, you see these port projects and industrial park projects that China's been working with a lot of countries in. When you see the COSCO managing ports around the Middle East and Mediterranean, they're creating these linkages, and this I think is where the real momentum for BRI is in the GCC. So in 2018, there was a China Arab States Cooperation Forum meeting in Beijing, and they announced this awkwardly named Industrial Park Port two-wheel, two-wing interconnectivity approach. And what this was taking a set of what at the time seemed seemingly unrelated projects, commercial projects in Abu Dhabi's Khalifa Port, in Oman's Duqm Port, in the naval base in Djibouti, in the industrial park they're developing in Saudi, industrial parks in Ain Sokhna and Port Said in Egypt. They all got linked together in this two-wing, two-wheel approach. And what you see is a physical architecture for China's commercial engagement from the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, into the Mediterranean. So again, when you look at internationally, the GCC countries offer, this intra-regional connectivity that really feeds into a much bigger role for their engagement with China and BRI. Whereas Iran, domestically could provide a lot if their economy turns around, but at the same time, it doesn't connect to the same kind of stuff that these countries do. So I would expect to see a lot more momentum for the GCC countries in terms of the BRI engagement. The last point I'll make before I stop is the big question for all of this is always the U.S. And in this, I think, I guess what happens in DC over the next couple of days maybe will be instructive. Under Donald Trump, the U.S. has been offering a lot of Middle Eastern allies and partners this binary choice: cooperate with the U.S. or cooperate with China. There's no appetite for that in the region whatsoever. A lot of countries have very deep economic engagement with China. They've got very deep political and security engagement with the U.S., and they don't see a need to stop that. So I think China's role in the region really, the U.S. has a lot of influence in the shape that's going to take. So hopefully cooler heads prevail, and we'll see some diplomacy starting to take hold in the region, and maybe it can build a more constructive approach to the region. So I'll stop here, but look forward to some questions and some great insights from the other speakers. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Jonathan, and a great, very helpful place to end there in terms of today being the day it is and just how relevant all of this is at the moment. I'm going to pass over to Nilanthi Samaranayake from CNA next. And yeah, thank you very much. Over to you.
Great. Can you see me and hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay, great. All right. Well, good morning from the Washington, D.C. area. We're all on pins and needles for the inauguration today. I'm delighted to participate in this important discussion, and thanks to Dr. Filippo Boni and the Open University for the invitation to be here and share some of my personal research. I was asked to speak about China's infrastructure investments in South Asian ports and their implications for the region. So we're now about 15 years into this phenomenon where China has built port facilities, port terminals, and more broadly, maritime infrastructure in locations across South Asia, in Gwadar, Pakistan, Colombo and Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Chittagong, Bangladesh, and Maldives. And a persistent concern is that China could potentially convert one of these commercial facilities in the region somehow for military use. And observers call it a Chinese string of pearls in South Asia, and essentially see these pearls as surrounding the Indian peninsula. So all of this activity by China has certainly heightened India's threat perceptions. So against this backdrop, I want to make a few points. The first really has to do with methodology. When we're talking about China and South Asia, I think we need to separate out Pakistan from the smaller countries of South Asia. India, of course, is the largest country in South Asia and the dominant country. And some of the smaller South Asian countries are Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives, really in the maritime part of South Asia. Now, Filippo is a true expert on the China-Pakistan relationship, so I look forward to hearing what he has to say. But I'll just say that this is a long-standing bilateral relationship and really predates China's Belt and Road activities. Pakistan has a dynamic in South Asia that's fundamentally different from that of the smaller South Asian countries, just given the long-standing conflict between Pakistan and India, the fact that they fought multiple wars with each other, and also they're both nuclear armed countries. So I see Pakistan as being very different from the smaller countries of South Asia. The second point is that I see these countries as really having jumped on this, what I call a connectivity bandwagon. Essentially, they have an insatiable appetite for ports, airports, roads, highways, railways, any infrastructure that can enhance their internal connectivity as well as external connectivity. And I think this has been part of the assumption of globalization for the last 20 years, where connectivity is seen essentially as the ticket to economic success. It's been almost an article of blind faith by these countries. And I think COVID-19 to some degree, it has forced us to rethink this assumption, because we're seeing the limits of connectivity and connectivity dependent industries such as tourism and the remittance economy. Now, the smaller South Asian countries, for their part, they mostly are focused on development, and they have national economic goals that they're trying to meet. And 3 of these countries are in the maritime realm. So they're looking to leverage their position and seek increased infrastructure to expand their ties to regional trading networks and beyond. I think it's important to note that in South Asia, a lot of these Chinese projects, the demand has really come from within the smaller countries of South Asia. It's not a case where we've seen Beijing dictating down to these countries about the projects. India, of course, for its part, does not wish to permit China to invest in strategic infrastructure like ports. Even just the past year, looking at the border conflict has certainly elevated threat perceptions in India, and we've even seen the loss of life. But I think it's important to note, though, that for the smaller countries of South Asia, the research does suggest that it's been more of a bottom-up demand in South Asia for these Chinese projects. So essentially, China is an attractive development partner to these countries, but China is also a fallback option when other more attractive sources of financing are not forthcoming. Some of those sources are multilateral development banks like the World Bank, or even Japan. Japan, I would argue, is actually preferred over China. The third point I'll make is essentially the leaders from the smaller South Asian countries. They understand India's threat perceptions. I mentioned the border conflict that we've seen in the last year only have been heightened just in the last 12 months. So really these leaders of the smaller South Asian countries, they go out of their way to emphasize their refusal to permit China to establish military bases in their territories, in their ports. We'll sometimes hear them talk about their India first policies and how they defer to India's security interests. And there's a reason for this. These countries, they have experienced the negative repercussions from India in terms of their strategic relations with India as the dominant country in the region. So sometimes it's been through economic blockades or military operations, sometimes unwelcome, showing India's military operational reach. So this possibility is never far from these leaders' minds when it comes to China. So finally, to address the question, what are the implications of China's infrastructure investments in South Asian ports in the region? I think you can think about it in terms of a best case scenario, a worst case scenario, and perhaps a middle ground. So at best, these Chinese projects, they help to increase connectivity. And South Asia, after all, is one of the least integrated regions in the world. So that's really a best case scenario, that China is actually an enabler of development and connectivity. A worst case scenario would be that these Chinese projects, they will somehow facilitate a foothold by China into South Asia. And potentially we could see a military base in one of these countries. I think it is notable, though, I mentioned some of the mitigating factors to preventing this type of an outcome from within the smaller South Asian countries. But this string of pearls discussion has really been around in the region for the last 15 years. And I think it's important to note, I think most observers thought that the first Chinese overseas base would be in one of these locations that I mentioned in South Asia. But the first Chinese overseas base was not in South Asia, but it was in Africa, in Djibouti. So I think we need to look more closely about what are some of the limiting factors in South Asia, as well as looking at some of the concerns potentially of China's activities. So those are really best case, worst case scenarios. And I think there's also a middle ground we need to think about, which is essentially what we're seeing now, where some South Asian countries that are already struggling with debt can assume more debt to pursue certain Chinese projects. And that's difficult because some of the infrastructure can also be unsustainable and not necessarily directly lead to income for the country. So it's really, we're still about 15 years in, but this experiment with Chinese projects, it has not yet concluded. So really the assessment is still to be determined, and I'll stop there.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Nilanthi. And it's really interesting to get that broader kind of long-term perspective on, how we've got to this stage of development so far. I think what we're going to do now then is move from those smaller South Asian states onto one of the larger ones, Pakistan, which is Filippo's main area, and I expect he'll talk about somewhat in the next bit. So over to you, Filippo.
Thanks, Precious. And yes, absolutely. We're gonna stay in South Asia, and I will look a little bit more specifically at the dynamics of Chinese investments in Pakistan since 2013. And as Nilanthi has already touched on, South Asia has really been one of the key regions as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is home to India, which has been one of the biggest opponents of the initiative, as well as Pakistan, which has been at the very heart of the Belt and Road Initiative with the development of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, and one of the very first countries to embrace the initiative. If we just think that some of the MOUs, the Memorandum of Understandings around the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor were signed in the summer of 2013, even before the BRI was officially launched. And Pakistan was not only the first country to jump on the BRI ship, but also the country that so far has received the largest amount of investment. Depending on whose estimates we look at, we're in the range between $25 billion to $29 billion that materialized on the ground and that are at different stages of implementation. So in these introductory remarks, I think it would be useful to sort of provide a brief overview of how the China-Pakistan economic corridor has been absorbed and received, and what the dynamics that these investments under the CPEC umbrella have set in motion, both geopolitically and domestically. So in this context, I will try to make three main points. First of all, the first one is that as part of the wider US-China competition, Pakistan has, ever since 2013, aligned ever closely to China. And I would argue that this shift is qualitatively different from other historical instances where the two countries were quite close, and this is precisely because of the BRI investment. The second one, which is also a direct consequence of the first point, is that such a progressive shift away from the US has, on the one hand, further exacerbated tensions with India, while simultaneously allowing Pakistan to explore other bilateral ties with other countries, such as Russia, for instance, which is something that would have been really difficult to think about and imagine even only just 10 years ago. And the third point, which I will make towards the end of the presentation, is that we also need to look at the domestic implications of this. And there is a need to think about Pakistan's role in the wider BRI through an agency lens. And I will get back to this a little bit more in detail towards the end of this overview. So the first point about the strategic shift and the decision that Pakistan made to move closer to China, I think that, I mean, there have been times in history where we've seen that the two countries were quite close, and I'm thinking particularly about the decade over the 1970s, the 1990s, but this time it's quite different because of the amount of political and financial capital that China has invested in Pakistan, and also as a result of the growing US-India intent. So China's really entered into Pakistan's economy. As I was saying before, we're looking at huge amounts of money that are being poured into the Pakistani economy. And this has been really unprecedented. The relationship, as I've sort of argued in my work so far, until the advent of the Belt and Road Initiative was primarily based around the military-to-military dimension. What the BRI has added has been the economic pillar. The economic dimension has really become a regular staple in discussions, which wasn't the case before. There have been concerns about the way in which this economic relationship is developing, whether it's around some of the issues that also Jonathan was referring to at the beginning, whether it was about the debt trap, the sort of labor dynamics. But overall, the ties between the two countries, precisely because of the BRI investment, are in a different position than they were before. Let's also not forget that the China-Pakistan economic corridor, until very recently, now they've sort of scaled down the rhetoric around it a little bit, but until very recently was defined as the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative. And it wasn't a definition that was coming from Pakistan, it was a definition provided by Chinese Premier in 2014. So it was very prominent in the wider Belt and Road Initiative. The second point, which follows directly from this first one, is that such an ever closer reliance on China has triggered a number of other developments in Pakistan's geopolitical calculations. And I think that the relationship with Russia, it's an interesting example also because it speaks to the wider Eurasia discussions that we're having in today's webinar. I mean, of course, some of these trends do not start precisely with the Belt and Road initiatives. In particular, with Russia, we're looking at the trend that was set in motion in 2011, but that was really accelerated by Pakistan getting closer and closer to China. We've seen high-profile visits from both civilian and military leaders, which have become very frequent. In 2014, the two countries signed a defense agreement, which was followed by the Druzhba exercises, which, I mean, Precious will correct me, but it should mean friendship in Russian. And these military exercises have really become a regular staple in Russia-Pakistan military relations. And as it often happens in Pakistan's foreign policy, the defense component is quite important. And the fact, if we look at the Russian arms exports to Pakistan between 2011 and 2019, they are at 368 million, which is more than in the previous 20 years since the Russian Federation came to exist. And in the sort of 8-9 years that we're looking at now, Moscow is the fourth arms supplier to Pakistan after China, the US, and Italy. This is not to say that, I mean, of course, the cooperation between Russia and the bilateral ties between Russia and India are in a qualitatively different position than the ones between Pakistan and Russia. If we just think that Russian arms exports to India were 19.3 billion between 2011 and 2019, there is no comparison between the way in which the sort of relationship is unfolding. But with India, that is signaling an increasing willingness to expand its military-to-military partnership with the US, and with a simultaneous growing Sino-Russian sort of condominium over Eurasia, I think ties between Moscow and Islamabad should really be followed closely, and I would argue are also a natural follow-up of how the BRI investment is unfolding within Pakistan. The sort of third and final point pertains more to the domestic dynamics underpinning the development of the China-Pakistan economic corridor and of the BRI more broadly. And I think we need to look at the way in which and the importance of domestic agency in which BRI projects are being implemented. This also sort of relates to what Nilanthi was mentioning before about that some of these projects were also bottom-up. While there is often the perception that BRI projects are parachuted, simply following China's priorities and neglecting those of recipient countries. What we've seen is that actually it's a much more complex interaction, and we have a host of domestic actors, whether it's political parties, whether it's businesses, whether it's militaries, whether it's NGOs, and so on and so forth, which interact with Chinese SOEs, diplomats, institutions. So it's really the BRI. It's really the result of these interactions, these encounters, and the way in which agendas and interests are negotiated and eventually mediated. And I think this is an important point that goes very much beyond the case of Pakistan. And it's something that we really need to take into account a bit more broadly when we look at the Belt and Road Initiative in the wider Eurasian landscape. So I think I'll stop here and very much look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Filippo. That's really helpful, and a very nice kind of link between that South Asian context and then, the kind of broader Eurasian region, which I guess is what we're going to be talking about now, as I hand over to Dr. Moritz Pieper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Precious. I hope everyone can hear me well. Thanks also for having me to speak at today's event. I embarked on a longer-term research project on the effects of the BRI on Eurasia a couple of years back, the results of which will come out as a book later this year, as Precious has mentioned. And in the next 8 or so minutes, I will try and condense some of the research findings from that research, in which I focused in particular on a couple of selected case studies, namely Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Uzbekistan, in the wake of the Sino-Russian interaction in particular. I started this when I was still working as an academic. I then joined the German Foreign Office last year. So I should just like to add the small caveat that I speak here in the private capacity. So the conventional wisdom on the Sino-Russian dynamic in Eurasia, as we've all heard a couple of times before, not in this particular webinar, but on other occasions, it goes something like this. There's a division of labor which has so far prevented China's BRI from triggering outright resistance or even sabotage from Russia, and where China has become the economic powerhouse of the region, Russia has been granted a sort of right to remain the preeminent security actor in particular, and has used regional institutions like the Eurasian Economic Union, in which it remains dominant, as well as the Collective Security Treaty Organization, to sort of fend off outside influence and remain dominant in the post-Soviet space. I always find that this portrayal tends to deny agency of the actors in between, and that's what triggered my interest in looking into the effects of the BRI in places like Kazakhstan and Mongolia. Mongolia is an interesting case as it has developed a third neighbor policy, as it was called, in the 1990s, as a way to guard against a too strong dependence on any of its two neighbors, landlocked as it is, and sandwiched between China and Russia. And this third neighbor policy now is being affected by the government's embrace of a new form of trilateral talks with China and Russia in the wake of the BRI, seeing as China comes out in 2013 with the Silk Road Economic Belt. Mongolia seizes on the opportunity and sees it as a way of breaking out of its regional and international isolation, and then manages to have the China-Mongolia-Russia economic corridor added as a corridor of the Silk Road Economic Belt in 2016. Mongolia sees the Silk Road Economic Belt as a vehicle to also have goods transitioning or transiting from China to Russia and vice versa. That, however, is not the main interest of China in Mongolia, which is mainly interested in Mongolian copper and coal mines, and is even proposing to build infrastructure even up to these mines. China also became Mongolia's most important trading partner even before the advent of the BRI, and this is something that Russia is sort of eyeing with suspicion, even though Russia is retaining influence via energy supplies, mainly electricity and refined oil. That, however, in Mongolia is also seen with sort of skepticism as China's forceful economic statecraft, in which the tying of loans and investments is also linked to a level of political loyalty or an expectation of political loyalty, became very evident in Mongolia after the invitation expressed to the Dalai Lama in 2016 to visit the country, to which China reacted by closing the border and suspending all bilateral talks and even putting a 4.2 billion economic loan package on hold. So sort of a massive sanctions package. Kazakhstan, on the other hand, has likewise been confronted with challenges that result from its institutional and spatial overlap between the Eurasian Economic Union, Russia-dominated, and the Chinese-promoted Silk Road Economic Belt, which is going through Kazakh territory. Kazakhstan is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, unlike Mongolia and unlike Uzbekistan, but that has produced ambivalent results for Kazakhstan domestically, has been debated controversially as well, for a number of reasons that I won't go into detail now. But on the other hand, the official embrace on the part of the Kazakh government of the Chinese Silk Road Economic Belt has also not been without criticism on the part of business communities and local constituencies. There have been anti-Chinese protests in Kazakhstan, the latest of which took place in September 2019 over reports that China was planning to relocate factories to Kazakhstan. So mixed reactions and also a mixed sort of level of reception on the part of economic communities as opposed to the official governmental stance on the BRI. Then we have smaller but geographically more central and therefore also important Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan, which are recalibrating their strategic outlooks in a shifting political environment, where EA-EU membership is currently being studied in Uzbekistan, which would then also impact on Uzbekistan's tariff and trade policies towards China, of course. China has already become Uzbekistan's largest trading partner, while Russia also remains important in Uzbekistan, mainly for security governance, for security affairs. So that's something similar, a similar situation that we've seen in Kazakhstan as well. In Uzbekistan, however, we should not conflate or misconstrue the BRI as a causal factor pushing the Uzbek leadership towards making an alignment with either Russia or China. Uzbek shifting perspectives currently are the result rather of changing political realities on the ground that have to do with the ambitious reform agenda put forward by President Mirziyoyev since 2016. So domestic preference formation as one conclusion of my research in the socio-political fabric of these in-between countries constitutes one important element in the transformation of Eurasia. Some recipient actors willingly take up the offers that come with this whole language of connectivity and economic corridors, and even offer their own complementary framework programs, as we've seen in Kazakhstan with the Nurli-Jol program being linked or docked to the Silk Road Economic Belt. Same thing happened in Mongolia with the Steppe Road initiative being docked to the Silk Road Economic Belt. But then we also have the impact of different governance models that also have an effect on the transformation of the geopolitical space, namely a more democratic governance culture that we have in Mongolia, the only democracy in the region, where we've seen more parliamentary debates on the pros and cons of China's involvement, heated debates over mining rights, over foreign investment laws, etc., while criticism of foreign economic policies were or have been less muted, or have been more muted, let's say in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where the space for civil society has also been shrinking. So where are we going from here? Just at least two scenarios that I should briefly like to touch on in my finishing remarks. First scenario, Mongolia, the Central Asian states, and partners further west across Eurasia, like Iran, that Jonathan has touched on, certainly feel the gravitational pull of this evolving Sino-Russian relationship. But they have a foreign policy leeway of pick and choose. So they develop policies that accommodate the interests of both these big powers in the region, depending on the policy domain at hand. And the multi-vector agenda of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan is a case in point. The third neighbor policy of Mongolia is a case in point. And then in this more optimistic scenario, regional institutions like the Silk Road the Shanghai Cooperation Organization could also serve as sort of platforms to channel policies in a multilateral setting. If, however, and that's the second scenario, the sort of junior partner scenario, Russia will be completely marginalized by China and Eurasia. This is the junior partner scenario that we often hear about. Then the sort of financial dependence of already cash-strapped economies like also Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan will translate into a level of even political subordination. Both of these countries, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, depend heavily on Russia for remittance economies, but also for security. While enormous Chinese investments in sectors like infrastructure, mining, industries, agriculture has led to a compounding of external debts to China. And the consequences for other Eurasian actors in this scenario would be the elimination of the possibility to uphold any kind of balancing options. One final point, the BRI and Russia's Greater Eurasia talk or narrative are often couched in the language of economic corridors, but they also contain an element of ideational bonds, transnational bonds, what China refers to as people-to-people ties, and beyond a language around these economic corridors, there's little societal resemblance between China and Russia, or between China and any actors across Central Asia. Let's say beyond the legitimacy of authoritarianism at the level of national governance. So the language of docking of these regional connectivity initiatives can only do so much, can only serve so much to address people-to-people ties. And I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all the speakers actually as well for so amazingly staying to time, which makes this much easier to chair. So I personally appreciate that. I'm going to ask if the audience have any questions, please to post them in the chat. And I'll kind of collect and collate and direct those. What I will say is what I've found really interesting listening to all of these kind of cross-regional perspectives is just how much it kind of draws together some really important key themes that I think sometimes do get lost in the discussions of the BRI. And something that came up in so many of those presentations was this sort of the question about the economic side of the BRI versus the kind of potentially geopolitical or military balancing act, I guess. And if not balancing, then maybe recalibration to some extent. And I found that interesting that it was coming up across with all of those regional actors. And the second thing, I think, not to overshadow this, something that all of you really brought home to us was the importance of the role of agency and the kind of, the bottom-up priorities. So the ways in which those domestic priorities are still are still being pursued, and not just domestic priorities, but also red lines in some cases that you've kind of brought to our attention. So I found that really interesting. So thank you very much, all of you. Can I ask the speakers, please, to switch back on their cameras for now? As I say, if there's any questions, please post them in the chat box. I think we have one already, which I'll just start with. We'll maybe go in order of speakers for this one, if anybody, or if any of you do want to come on this. This was what is the future role of Japan? And a second question, again, for any of the speakers who wish to answer, is in relation to the people-to-people ties that Moritz just ended on. Where has China done best in that regard, and what initiatives has it undertaken in your respective geographical areas that have facilitated some of those kind of people-to-people exchanges? So I'll hand over first to Jonathan if he wants to come in at all on either of those.
Sure. In terms of the role of Japan, I think this is really interesting because one of the other speakers mentioned it might have been Nilanthi, that Japan is actually a preferred infrastructure and development partner for a lot of countries, and it's been really the leading Asian source of development for decades. One of the issues with the BRI from the first place was just that the Asian Development Bank just couldn't really provide, and the IMF and the World Bank just didn't have the capital needed for a lot of Asian infrastructure requirements. And this was meant to be a complement to the existing structure. So the role of Japan, I think, is just to continue offering really high quality opportunities. One of the things that comes into it, again, with the geopolitical aspect, is Japan's really bad relations with China and alignment with the US, and this Indo-Pacific narrative that the US has been using to promote kind of a counter BRI across the Indian Ocean region and Eurasia, really kind of aligns Japan with an anti-BRI bloc. So whether or not that plays out in this way will be a very interesting geopolitical question. But you see with the Quad, with India, for example, and Japan and Australia and the U.S., there seems to be this kind of normative element of this grouping of democracies that see a different approach to I guess the Indo-Pacific region. In terms of the people-to-people ties, this is quite interesting because Moritz, I think, brought up a good point. While there is a lot of political overlap that we've seen countries that have been very enthusiastic for BRI, authoritarian states tend to be quite happy to engage with China on a lot of this stuff. But at the same time, on the people-to-people level, there's very little. So here in the Gulf, when I ask my students are all Emirati. And when I'll ask them, what do you know about China? They'll say, well, it's the biggest country, it's the richest country, it's the most powerful country, all these superlatives. But they know nothing about it. If I say who's the president, they often can't say. If I ask them to name a popular, like a famous Chinese movie star, they usually say Bruce Lee, which, of course, came from California. So there's not really a lot of depth in terms of that cultural side, where you'll see Japan with its anime and manga have really deep ties here, and India with very long-standing cultural and familial connections in the Gulf. China's the new guy, and it hasn't really been able to capitalize on this yet. Part of it is that their soft power projection is weak because Leninist states do soft power really badly, so whereas Korea with their K-pop and their TV shows are hugely attractive here, nobody really wants to watch a bunch of movies glorifying the Chinese Communist Party or the Belt and Road, odes to the Belt and Road in hip hop. What we have seen is that they've been doing outreach in terms of education. Here in the Gulf, you see a lot of Chinese language instruction that's been, they've introduced it into the K-12 curriculum in the UAE. They're introducing it in Saudi as well. I don't think that's because people feel a particular affinity towards China and its culture, but I think they see it as an important language of the future. So there has been an outreach in terms of the educational side of things. There's been a lot of tourism, but again, as somebody mentioned, under COVID, that's really kind of put everything on the back burner. But in terms of other types of people-to-people outreach, it's really kind of a blank slate at this point in the Gulf in particular, and the Middle East in general.
Sure, I'll go next. That's a great question about Japan. Yeah, I would argue in the smaller South Asian countries that Japan is certainly the preferred partner, whereas China is more of the fallback option. Japan has been a critical development partner to these countries, particularly in Sri Lankan ports for decades, going back to like the 70s and 80s. And even now, Japan is investing in a port project in Colombo. In Maldives, Japan was their first choice to work with them on their airport, which is critical to bring in income for the country because they rely on luxury tourism. But interestingly, they couldn't quite get the rate that they wanted with Japan, and then they went to China. So China is really that fallback option. And in Bangladesh, that was an interesting case where Bangladesh now is actually, Japan is actually helping to build a port in Bangladesh, but China had actually been in the lead for years, and many people actually thought that Bangladesh would conclude an agreement with China for a port in Sonadia, and literally at the summit where the Prime Minister visited China, and she backed off at the last minute, and the consensus really is due to really pressure from India. So that was a case where Japan, was able to essentially take that project away, where many observers thought that would go to China for years. To the question about the people-to-people ties, I agree with Jonathan's points that really this is the area where China is the weakest. There just isn't that affinity or that kind of cultural connection there. There's actually a lot of mistrust of China on the ground in the smaller countries of South Asia. So you just see it just in terms of the interactions, like Chinese workers, for example, how they live in some of these countries, very clustered together in communities as opposed to being more integrated. English language facility, that's another barrier as well. So there are some real clear cultural barriers that you see in the smaller South Asian countries with regard to China. But it is interesting, though, to see perhaps some of the more heavy-handed attempts to try to address this. In Bhutan, for example, China will often give away sort of free trips to China, come look at Chinese tourism, that kind of thing, to try to build these ties, which I don't know to what extent that's actually successful. But I think some speakers have talked about this, but essentially where China is effective is where other countries are not as giving or as permitting. So we've talked a lot about financing, but with the issues of no strings attached, like in the UN Human Rights Council, that I think is where China certainly provides something, certainly like for Sri Lanka, which had a very controversial civil war and managing of that. What China gives to Sri Lanka Lanka in the UN Human Rights Council is essentially that no strings attached policy. So not really people-to-people ties, but that is something that is certainly welcome from China.
I'll go next. We're just following the order of presentations. All very good questions, and I'll just briefly add a couple of thoughts about both the role of Japan as well as the people-to-people ties. The first one, I mean, Japan, it's interesting because now, as far as the China-Pakistan economic corridor is concerned, what we're seeing is that one of the big new areas, although there are some difficulties in moving things forward on this, are the special economic zones, which are supposed to be areas where Chinese industries can relocate and invest in Pakistan. It was actually Japan that was first in negotiations with the Pakistani government around 2012 as far as special economic zones were concerned. Then things didn't move the way they should have, and then the BRI came in. But so, I mean, Japan has been, and I think this also chimes with what Nilanthi was saying in her initial remarks, that, I mean, of course, Japan is very active as far as investments in the region are concerned. When it comes to the people-to-people ties, this is something that, I mean, has been really probably the weakest component, even in a relationship like the one between Pakistan and China that has all the sorts of rhetorics and florid language attached to it. There isn't much. There have been a few initiatives set in motion in the past few years, thinking about scholarships for Pakistani students to study in China, cultural festivals, the Year of Pakistan-China Friendship, but this really still amount to the elite level. There is very little penetration, I think, of Chinese ways into the deep end of the Pakistani society. So I think that's something that it's really still missing overall.
Yeah, just to add to that from my part, I also agree with what previous speakers have been saying about China's efforts to promote itself as a more active sort of cultural diplomacy actor. So in Central Asia, for instance, it has opened 5 Confucius Institutes in Kazakhstan. It has now Confucius Institutes open in Tashkent and Samarkand in Uzbekistan. Then, of course, yeah, the issue of scholarships. So the Silk Road Education Fund is now offering or giving out scholarships. So China is trying to get China's message across, or China's narrative across via student exchanges, giving out scholarships for students abroad coming to China. Generous PhD scholarships, all these kind of things. That also chimes with China's efforts to replace a certain discourse on globalization also in international institutions. So, I mean, that I think that's an interesting tendency that we're seeing in recent years, where China is going away from the sort of previous discourse associated with the Hu Jintao era of, you know, win-win and harmonious cooperation, harmonious coexistence, or this kind of almost laughable Chinese discourse that is now being replaced with a more, well, also terms that make for awkward translations in English, like, you know, community of mankind, destiny of mankind, and all the rest of it, but also increasingly trying to replace Western terms of globalization with, you know, terms that we also use. I mean, we in a sort of monolithic block that the West, of course, isn't either, but also trying to replace language that, in the long term, it is hoped will get us closer to understanding the Chinese perspective next to all these kind of language and student exchanges. But what doesn't help China's effort in that regard on the ground is of course chauvinistic remarks we've been seeing in places like Mongolia, where a predominantly Buddhist country is being approached in a very culturally chauvinistic manner. Remarks coming from Chinese officials don't help either, to the effect that Mongolia was part of China once, which of course isn't true historically, and passes over a more complex history between the Manchu and Yuan dynasties. But it's sort of a very chauvinistic discourse that doesn't help to advance people ties on the ground. And in that regard, and I'll finish on that point, Russia, of course, has a more residual influence in Central Asia, where, of course, you do still have language familiarity. Russia has very easy access in places like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan because they speak the same language. There's a common history, a common post-Soviet or a common Soviet history that also translates into post-Soviet, familiarity in a way. Besides all other kinds of political disagreements that you may have in other policy domains, but that does give Russia more of a competitive edge over China, at least in terms of cultural diplomacy.
Great, thank you very much. Now we've got a glut of questions now, so I'm going to introduce some of those. Speakers, if you wouldn't mind going in reverse order for these, because at least one of them is directed towards you, Moritz, so I wouldn't mind giving you that first. I'm going to start by the question that sort of links onto this sort of soft power and people-to-people issue, which is, can the BRI project create the kind of influence and domination for China globally as common perception among countries like USA, Japan, or India can, or is the BRI kind of overestimated in that regard? And then the one directly for you, Moritz, was about concerning the multi-vector policy of Kazakhstan, but also Uzbekistan. So do you see a shift from the multi-vector policy towards a single vector, which is China, even if that's involuntarily? And if so, what would that mean for the potential success of the BRI? And then I'll take one of the institutional questions as well. I won't bombard you with all of them at once, but one of the institutional questions was from Britta Wyfern, which was, how has the role of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the region changed since India and Pakistan joined in 2017? So if we just take those few for now, and then I'll send you through another batch after everyone's had a chance to answer those. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll jump straight in with the question on the multi-vector policy first. I mean, when we look at Kazakhstan, for instance, Kazakhstan is a country that ever since the 1990s, under President Nazarbayev, has been trying to continue this multi-vector policy or multi-vector foreign policy in a Eurasian context. So Nazarbayev was very much always a proponent of any forms of Eurasian integration. Has actually been credited even by the Kremlin as the progenitor of the greater Eurasia idea, which of course then has been later picked up on by the Kremlin with this greater Eurasia vision. But Kazakhstan already during the 90s was quick to put out these kind of narratives and notions of Eurasian integration, which of course back then was meant as a way of balancing options and not becoming too closely aligned only with Russia, just because it had just come out of the Soviet Union. Actually, the last country to leave the Soviet Union in 1991. Today, of course, that multi-vector foreign policy is something that Kazakhstan still upholds as a way of not becoming too dependent on China either in the wake of the Silk Road economic belt. But here, as I tried to outline in my talk, we already have an important institutional argument, which is that Kazakhstan is, by nature of its institutional design, already destined to conduct a more multi-vector foreign policy than, say, Uzbekistan, because it is part of the Eurasian Economic Union, and as such, it has given away certain competencies. external tariff policies, for instance, will, after a transition period that Kazakhstan is still facing until 2024, be a competence of the Eurasian Economic Commission. So institutionally, that also gives Russia a certain veto power over trade and tariff policies towards China. So in that regard, Kazakhstan already has an institutional buffer against single vector policies. As far as Uzbekistan goes, that is more complex because Uzbekistan is not a member of that union, is currently studying the option of maybe joining it. It has, if I'm not mistaken, last year taken the decision to become an observer, at least, of the EIEU. What is taking place within Uzbekistan now after Mirziyoyev came to power was that it is trying to conduct this multi-vector policy as a way of reaching out to Western economies, Japan, the US, European investors. So it is trying to balance options, in order to have other investors coming to the country, FDI pouring into Uzbekistan, other than Russian and Chinese investments. In 2019, mind you, Uzbekistan was named Country of the Year by The Economist. So, the doing business index went very well for Uzbekistan. So these are all indicators that also trade and economic policy-wise, Uzbekistan has more options than just becoming a single vector, or succumbing to a single vector policy with either of its big neighbors.
Thank you. Filippo, come in.
Yeah, I'll start from the SCO question, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization one, because I think it's very interesting, and thanks, Britta, for the question. If we take a step back and look at how the sort of the discussions around India and Pakistan joining the SCO were looking like at the time, there was a lot of cautious optimism, I would say, that the two countries would sort of be able to, and by bringing the two countries into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so into an institution, they would be able to sort of mitigate some of their some of the issues, the bilateral issues between the two of them. What we've seen in the past 3 years, and I mean, it's a slightly different, it's a slightly different story. The conflict between the two countries has actually worsened. And if we take, for instance, the RATS framework, which is the regional anti-terror structure, I mean, countries before India and Pakistan joined were relatively comfortable sharing information and being part of this framework, which also includes some of the intel sharing about terrorist activities. And since Pakistan and India joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the working and the actual functioning of the RATS framework has become much more difficult. So this is something that, I mean, it's a small example, but I think it tells a little bit more about the wider dynamics that have been set in motion by the two countries joining the organization. With regards to the question about the BRI and global influence, I think, I mean, if we look at, that's why I think a discussion like the one we're having today is quite important, because we look at it in a comparative perspective. And the way, and what Precious was mentioning before, that agency and the way in which we should not just interpret the BRI as, as an hegemonic ambition. Well, while there might as well be elements of that, there are also inputs that are coming from countries from recipient countries of Chinese investment. So I think that's something that we need to appreciate when we look at the wider BRI. There are Chinese motivations, but there are also the agendas and the political and economic agendas of countries that deal with China on a bilateral basis. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but I would say that we need to bring in some nuance in the way in which we look at it.
Thanks, Filippo. Nilanthi?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take the question about working together for the common good rather than competing against one another, talking about China, the US and Russia. Speaking from a US perspective, I think it's really, the three countries really have different takes, I would argue, about what they see as the common good, or what type of a strategic outcome each country would be interested in. Really, from a US perspective, the past 4 years, we've seen in US national strategy great power competition really being the organizing principle behind US strategy and policy. And the 2017 National Security Strategy identified both China and Russia as great power competitors to the United States. And I think from the looking at China's activities, looking at China's interpretation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in the South China Sea and East China Sea. From a US perspective, those seem like assertive activities, aggressive activities. And then just, most recently, we've seen the Russian hacking of US government systems. So while Russia doesn't get quite as much attention as China does in its dynamic rise, even its asymmetric actions still generate significant effects for US strategy and defense planners. So I think really these three countries have different visions of what type of outcome they want. So I think that's really what we're seeing now, but a lot of questions remain with the inauguration of a new president. To what extent will this administration depart from the great power competition framework that we've seen really be so consistently applied to US strategy and policy over the last 4 years? There's some suggestion that the US may focus more attention on Russia as a great power threat, whereas a lot of the focus has been on China from a US perspective. So there's some question, will both of those countries be considered an equal threat to the United States? But it does seem that that era of strategic competition is, at least from a US perspective, for the most part here to stay, unfortunately. So.
Thanks, Nilanthi. And Jonathan, do you want to come in on those?
Sure. So in terms of the question about the SCO, that's kind of actually interesting because there is a bit of a Gulf link there, because after that last round of expansion, or I guess first round of expansion, there was talk that we'd see the next round coming soon, and it would involve Turkey and Iran. That seemed to be this constant. I mean, Iran's had an observer status since 2005, I think. It applied for membership about 13 years ago. And the excuse is always, well, you're under UN sanctions, so you can't. And then when the sanctions were removed, there seemed to be some momentum, especially from Russia, for including Iran in the next round. Of course, with the US change in approach to Iran, that seems to have stopped it. And I think that's probably China's preference, because bringing Iran and Turkey into the SCO would really cause a lot of headaches in the Middle East. It would cause a lot more problems than it would solve, because both those countries have a very revisionist bent in the region, and it would cause problems for the countries that China is the most deeply engaged with. And I think it's important to point out China's biggest partners in the region are all US partners and allies. So kind of feeding off that last point that you just made, Nilanthi, is that China's not really the revisionist threat that Russia is in the Middle East. China's really kind of more of a status quo great power. Most of its interests in the region are very in line with the US. They just have a different approach. And I think that's a point that keeps getting lost because of this great power competition idea that they're destined to fight. They're destined for war, as Graham Allison put it. Whereas in the Middle East, it doesn't make sense. They both seem to want the same stuff. The question about is BRI overestimated, I think, is a really good one. I would argue it's not overestimated, it's underanalyzed, and it's ill-defined. It's always described as this strategic response to the US, and China keeps saying, and whether or not you want to believe it, they keep saying it's not a strategy, it's an initiative. A strategy is targeting a third country, an initiative is open to everybody. That's, I think, why they keep making this point, because they want it to not be seen. One thing China's foreign policy, I think, has been very, very conscious of is it doesn't want to stir up any nests in Washington. It wants to try to continue to work under this US-led order as long as it can, and of course introduce more, they always say, democratic features to the international order to bring in the concerns of a lot of other great powers. So I think on the one side, a lot of folks who analyze the BRI always take it as this counterpoint to, it's a new world order, in contrast to the maybe overwrought perception that the U.S. is on its way out, which I think is obviously up for debate. But a lot of that is China's own fault, because it's been really, really, really bad at defining what it is. It starts out as the maritime Silk Road economic belt, and then it's goes from this economic corridor approach to bringing in the digital Silk Road, and then the Arctic Silk Road, and then the Health Silk Road, and everything Silk Road. I mean, what is it at this point? It's everything. And I talked to a Chinese diplomat in the region a few years ago, and I said, there's no Gulf countries or Arabian Peninsula countries in these corridors. Does that mean it doesn't fit in the BRI? And he said, any kind of cooperation with China is BRI. So, if that's the starting point, that BRI is everything, you can't blame people for wondering what it is. But I would say, really, if you look at it as a series of projects meant to promote intra-regional connectivity, it's got a really commercial focus, but it also has, it's always seen as this infrastructure project. And I think it's interesting to see right now, there are these other cooperation priorities like policy coordination. So in the Gulf, we've seen less movement towards infrastructure because a lot of countries are cash poor right now, but there's policy coordination in terms of combating COVID, where Chinese companies are working in AI or vaccine development and distribution or PPE or whatever. So I think the beauty of it in its poor definition is that it can really morph into a lot of different things. You're not going to see as much. We haven't seen since 2016 as much overseas lending, but you are seeing greater policy coordination or greater cooperation in other spheres. So I think that means it's probably not likely to die a sudden death anytime soon. It probably will continue to keep transitioning into other stuff.
Brilliant, thank you, Jonathan. Now, we still have quite a lot of questions remaining. I'm going to do the awful thing and bombard you with them now and say, speakers, can you kind of limit yourselves to about 2 minutes in your responses? So just pick which ones you want to come in on. And I'll kind of group them together. So one of them follows on for this idea of, particular sort of connectivity and infrastructural connectivity. And it's a question from Anya Mir, who points out that we do tend to view the BRI mainly in terms of connectivity. But are there any instances in which the BRI has led to any sort of economic or other kind of divide over the past 10 years? And the example she cites is potentially separating EU from its Eastern or Middle Eastern neighbouring countries in terms of trade. And there's a second kind of specific question, again, which leads on from your comments, so thank you, Jonathan. This is from Eram Ashraf, who's asking about the declining funding from China for projects in the kind of post-COVID environment. And the specific he's thinking of there is about the situation with ML1 railway project in Pakistan under CPEC, and apparently loans not being forthcoming from China. So those are two kind of specific queries that have been raised. We then have some sort of more general ones. So we have one question that's a lovely question, really. So it's about, is there any possibility of seeing a change in mentality? This is the one that Nilanthi sort of already alluded to, if we focus more on kind of the common good rather than competition. So if people's interests are considered, this is from Edward Shatochin, who then clarified he was talking specifically about, unity amongst people. And we also had something similar on this from Yue Wang, who was asking about, potential future goods. So in terms of energy projects in particular, are any of those energy projects under the BRI potentially becoming greener? Because many of those state-owned companies tend to rely on coal-fired power plants. So are there any kind of roadblocks for integrating greener energy into the BRI, for instance, CPEC? And then to finish off, we have a couple more questions about the sort of regime and competition side of things. So Gulihina Shahzad has asked, what is the role of regime type affinity with China's involvement under BRI? So the kind of ideological inclination of authoritarianism in potentially some Eurasian countries or other autocracies, and the extent to which it's important that China might offer a new development model that's not reliant on a prerequisite of democracy. So the extent to which any of the speakers think that that is significant. As well as a question on whether or not the BRI promotes cooperation or competition between China and Russia in particular. But I guess, you know, you could transport that question right to any of your regions, because you've all kind of talked about the potential economic versus military balancing and recalibration. We have one specifically for Jonathan, which is if you could please say a little more about the potential of Fajay report in the UAE, it being on the Indian Ocean side of the Straits of Hormuz in terms of BRI investment, how this might compete or complement the Omani port of Duqm in the context of UAE and Oman relations under Sultan Haytham. So another competition and cooperation type question there. Just to mix it up a bit, maybe if we switch the order, as I say, try and keep the remarks brief if you can, please. Filippo, are there any of those you want to come in on?
Yeah, sure. Well, all very good questions. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I'm not sure. The first question, if I understood it correctly, rather than seeing the BRI as a sort of, as promoting connectivity, it's more a divide and rule kind of dynamic. And to an extent, I think I will move to Europe with this discussion. But I think what we've seen is that when Italy, for instance, in March 2019 signed the MOU on the BRI, was the first Western European country to do so, and there were clearly very unhappy faces in Brussels and in other European capitals. And it was a very smart diplomatic move on China's side to bring Italy on board so officially when it comes to the BRI. So in political terms, I think we've seen some of that in the way in which China has approached its relations, its bilateral ties under the BRI. CPEC and ML1, yes. The difficulty here is that I think the answer is in 2 points. The first one is that the BRI is really a moving target, and as Jonathan was saying, I mean, it's the lack of definition. I think it's deliberate, and because it can transform. If you define something, then it's easier to say what it's not. But if you don't define it, it can be anything, and it can evolve as needs, priorities, and strategies develop as well. And when it comes to Pakistan, I think the discussion around the ML1, what we've seen is that there has been several rounds of negotiations around the actual amount that was going to be financed, and these have changed according to the sort of political leaders that were in the country. It started under the PMLN, then the PTI came in and they revised they've tried to revise the overall cost of the project. So I think, again, here the idea of a moving target and of something which keeps evolving as priorities evolve as well. So it's really difficult to pin it down to one specific thing. Is the BRI greener? I don't think so. As far as the Pakistani experience is concerned of the BRI, most of the projects are coal power plants. There is one solar power plant in Punjab, a few hydroelectric projects, but the main bulk of the energy generation is represented by coal. So very short answer, but this is what the timing requires. Authoritarianism and regime type. I think that's a very good question. By looking over time at the experience between China and Pakistan, I think that regardless of the type of regime, we've seen very close coordination. And for one of the most comfortable interlocutors of China during the past 20 years has been a political party, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz. They were really comfortable dealing with them. They reverted back to the military, which has been the main sort of point of contact once the PMLN left power, but it's really difficult to draw any clear conclusions as to whether this is actually a very strong correlation. So thanks, I'll stop here.
Perfect, thanks, Filippo. Nilanthi, would you like to come in on any of those?
Sure. I see our time is running out. So just very briefly, the question about China's assistance before COVID, after COVID is really interesting. So in the smaller South Asian countries, China appears to be continuing its projects. So that's moving forward, and that's very much in the interests of the smaller South Asian countries that are trying to advance in their economic development and their integration development. But what's interesting is seeing actually the fact that these countries have been negatively affected by COVID, such as I mentioned the tourism industries in Sri Lanka, Maldives, Nepal, the remittance economies like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. It's interesting to see where China has actually helped provide loans to address some of these countries' debt problems, which were pre-existing. I think I agree with some of the speakers about the debt trap narrative has been overstated, because some of these countries, they're struggling with debt, even going beyond what is owed to China. But it's interesting to see the hundreds of millions of dollars that China has provided to Sri Lanka, just essentially to help bolster its foreign exchange reserves, which are very short and depleted due to the economic impacts of COVID. Also, with Maldives, China giving some debt suspension relief to Maldives, which also has a very high proportion of external debt, and including to China. So that's been an interesting to see China's financial assistance as a result of COVID.
Thanks, Nilanthi. And Jonathan, can I ask you to give us your brief response to one or two of those?
I'll take two. So in green projects, there was a Chinese initiative announced in 2014 called the 1+2+3 cooperation priority for how they're going to work with Arab countries, not Middle East, but Arab. And the three in this equation involved renewables and nuclear energy. So that's something that I think China has actually a pretty advanced technology. We've seen in Dubai, for example, that they were involved in creating this massive solar plant. A lot of Gulf countries in particular are trying to move towards more sustainable or renewable energy sources. So it could be an interesting outcome to see China actually as an energy supplier to the Gulf long term. As for the question about Fujairah and Duqm from Francis Outram, who, by the way, wrote a great book on Oman that I lean on very heavily when I was doing my dissertation. This is interesting because China had been moving towards Oman a lot up until about 2018. And then we saw that it really started to ease off. And I think what was happening in Duqm was that Chinese companies are very excited to invest in this. Duqm port could be a very important part of this two-wing, two-wheel approach I mentioned earlier. But I think the Omani government maybe is a little apprehensive of taking on too much Chinese debt, and they're trying to reach out to different actors. From what I'm talking, people in Oman have been telling me that India is actually making a lot more progress in a lot of projects than China has been recently. Fujairah could be interesting, but I don't get a sense that there's been a whole lot of Chinese projects happening there. Most of what's been going on in the Emirates, it's always the same. It's in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Abu Dhabi's definitely gotten a lot more of I guess they've gotten the lion's share in the past couple of years, but a Chinese company was involved in creating this pipeline to Fujairah a few years ago. So, there could be a potential. You're right. It would be a very valuable to have a port that bypasses the Hormuz dilemma and gets Gulf energy out to market. That could be something definitely in China's interest. So, watch this space.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Moritz, if there's anything you want to take as briefly as you can, that'd be great.
All right, I'll try to combine the Russia-China competition cooperation question with the question on regime typology. So when the BRI was announced in 2013, or the Silk Road Economic Belt, I should say, Russia wasn't mentioned at first. So for 1.5 years, there was this speculation as to how Russia might react, what China had in mind by omitting Russia. And if the BRI really was about infrastructure, as what was this obsession in that early phase of the BRI in the beginning, as we've discussed earlier on, then of course it would have made sense to use the Russian transit space, given that we're talking about one customs area, we're talking about the existence of the Trans-Siberian Railway and all these logistical advantages and issues that would have made sense to connect Russia with the Silk Road Economic Belt. So that was the big, that was the elephant in the room for a year and a half, really. And then at the May 2015 summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that question was finally answered with that cooperation agreement that China and Russia signed, what Russians refer to as the sopryazhenie, so the docking of the Eurasian Economic Union with the Silk Road Economic Belt. Then subsequently, we've seen working groups being set up that mostly do talk without any concrete results coming out of them, but at least officially there's this semblance of equality, which is important to Russia, sort of, if you will, as a safe phasing measure, while China accepts also that kind of notional equality, to not give out the impression that either China is forging any kind of anti-Russian alliances in the region, and that Russia is not forging any kind of or nurturing any kind of xenophobic sentiments across the post-Soviet space. So that was an important outcome. And that also, and that's the sort of bridge or link I'm trying to draw to regime typology, that also explains on a level of domestic governance what unites Russia and China in the region, and what might also explain why both countries have so far managed to avoid to avoid confrontation in the region, which is their shared interest in what the SCO sums up as the three evils, preventing or making sure the three evils are contained, which is separatism, terrorism, and extremism, which is of course a catch-all phrase for anything that they don't like domestically, which also goes back to the question we discussed earlier about people-to-people ties, why domestic constituencies in places like Kazakhstan are concerned about ethnic Kazakhs being detained in Xinjiang, neighboring Xinjiang. But that sort of container, which is the nation state, linked to a level of authoritarianism in terms of domestic governance, is something that, combined with the interest of pushing Western states out of the region, is what unites Russia and China, and which perhaps also links it to a level of global governance, which explains why so far they've managed to maintain a certain division of labor, or at least semblance of equality in Eurasia.
Fabulous, thank you so much. And I'd just like to thank, first of all, the speakers, because you've done an amazing job of bringing together all these cross-regional perspectives that I think do draw together those themes that sometimes get overlooked when we focus only on the specifics in one particular region, and have really given us a lot of food for thought in terms of how we need to think about the BRI, not forgetting issues such as agency and various kind of different sectoral balancings. I want to thank the audience as well. Thank you. You've given us some amazing questions, and I'm sorry we haven't had time for all of them, or for more of them, in fact, because it's been really, really interesting to discuss those. Now, if you do want to come to our next event, I have posted the details in the chat where you can get more information about that. But all that remains to say is thank you once again to everybody for coming along today, and I hope you have a pleasant rest of the day.